Consent is a basic component of many types of everyday encounter, but it is particularly relevant to the interaction between an individual and a healthcare professional or someone acting on their behalf. This is because without consent, many actions that are an integral part of healthcare, such as medical examination or treatment, are unlawful. For example, in a treatment setting, consent is required when a person is asked by a healthcare professional to agree to an examination, treatment, or care. In research, consent is required when a person is asked to take part in a research study or to allow their identifiable personal information to be used for research purposes. When a person seeks another's consent, it shows that they recognize that people should be able to make their own autonomous decisions. It shows respect for another's right to self-govern, to control their own destiny. The concept of informed consent builds on this idea and stresses the importance of giving a person making a decision enough relevant information to enable them to make meaningful decisions about themselves and their lives. Consent is often mistakenly used as shorthand to describe when a person completes and signs a consent form. In fact, consent has many components and is more properly viewed as a process. It covers a whole spectrum of interactions that may be more or less invasive or harmful and require varying amounts of communication between the parties. Where the risk of harm is small, the law can recognize imputed consent, where consent is assumed based on what is known about people. For example, because people want good quality medical treatment, it is assumed that people will not mind their X-rays, with any personal identifiers removed, being used to train doctors. Implied consent can be presumed based on a person's actions. If a person rolls up their sleeve when a nurse suggests taking their blood pressure, the nurse can assume that the person has consented to have it taken. Informed or express or explicit consent is more specific in the requirements it makes for both parties. It usually requires more information to be given to the person making the decision and requires that they make a specific choice, either yes or no, because the harm they might suffer is greater than in the other cases. For example, a researcher must obtain your consent before entering you into a clinical trial to test a new medicine, or a doctor before performing an invasive treatment. The greater the potential for harm, the greater need there is for informed consent. The need for informed consent arose in reaction to what are now considered unethical practices by researchers and clinicians in the early to mid-20th century and before. Historically, the relationship between a healthcare professional and their patient or research subject was more unequal than it is now. There was little expectation on both sides that a patient should question their doctor's decisions. Unfortunately, in some research, such as the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, begun in the 1930s, some healthcare professionals have used people as research subjects without their informed consent. In this study, researchers tracked the progress of the disease in subjects over many years, withholding penicillin that might have helped or even cured them. The horrors of the experimental practices used by the Nazi doctors during World War II led to the creation of the Nuremberg Code, which has as its first statement, "The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential." As society changed in the second half of the 20th century, individuals claimed more responsibility for their own lives and rights, as evidenced by the civil rights movement, feminism, and activism by minority communities, such as those suffering from HIV/AIDS or particular disabilities. This rise in autonomy as a human right has reinforced the importance of the informed consent process. Several criteria have been suggested for the informed consent process to be valid. The person must be able to understand the information presented to them and be able to make a decision. The person must be given enough information and at a sufficiently understandable level so that based on it they can make a decision. The person must understand the consequences of their decision. The person must be able to make their decision without being coerced. Finally, the person must give some indication of their consent, such as a verbal agreement or by signing a consent form. One way of thinking about the consent process may be like this. C. You are competent to make your decision. O. You are open to making the decision. N. You have the necessary background information to make the decision. S. You have the steps to be followed if you agree or disagree. E. You understand the explanation of those steps. N. You make your decision and notify someone. T. You tick the boxes and sign the form. Legally, as society has become more litigious, a valid consent is beneficial to protect both parties. A person could accuse a healthcare professional or researcher of trespass or assault if the person did not give their consent or if their consent was not voluntary. If the person is not sufficiently informed of the possible consequences of their decision, and they suffer as a result, they could accuse the healthcare professional or researcher of negligence. Therefore, through UK common law and healthcare legislation, informed consent is a requirement in most treatment and research settings. However, consent goes beyond legitimising actions that would otherwise be unlawful. There are differing opinions about the strong reliance now placed on informed consent. In treatment settings, is it ever possible to inform someone sufficiently on the complexities of a surgical procedure or a treatment regime, so that a person really understands the implications of their decision?
I must know everything about what I can expect before I can make a decision.
This information is too complex and too confusing to understand. I'll do what the doctor wants. They're the expert.
Some people, when faced with complex descriptions or multiple pages of information to join a clinical trial, simply sign consent forms without properly reading or trying to understand the information.
I want all the information available on this procedure so that I will understand what will happen.
I'm not interested in reading all this information, so I'll just sign the paper.
Some argue that requiring informed consent to use some types of personal information, such as medical records, hinders research by placing more weight on protecting the privacy of the individual over enabling research for the benefit of society.
I must be asked for my consent for all uses of my healthcare information, or it's a breach of my privacy. We can't ask everyone for their consent. It's too expensive and time-consuming, but without this research we won't know how safe and effective this treatment is.
Balancing these opposing views is difficult. Regardless, informed consent is a central part of the interaction between a healthcare professional or researcher and an individual, and is seen as one of the core fundamentals in the ethical conduct of treatment and research.